Hi, everyone. So we just read the short story 11 by Sandra Cicernos, and now we're going to start thinking about the story and how it's structured, how it's kind of built. And so I want to share with you my screen, and I want to talk a little bit about the story arc. So here's the story that we read 11 by Sandra Cicernos. And over here, we have a PowerPoint that's named Story Arc, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about what each of these things are. So let me make this bigger so everyone can see it. So we have some terminology, but don't worry about that. What I really want to talk about is what we call plot. So if you go see a movie, people are like, oh, what's it about? Well, when they're asking what's about, they're asking what is the plot. So the plot is the sequence of events told in the story. And there are 5 basic spots on a plot line. There's normally like the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. So these 5 aspects. So here has a great image, and I love this image because it's super, I think, simple and easy to understand, and we all get that. It's kind of like when you tell your friend to binge watch, oh, you need to binge watch the show that's out, and they're like, oh, I watched the first 2 episodes and they were really boring. You're like, no, stick with it. They're like, wait till episode 4, it gets really good. And we, of course, are really impatient as watchers and viewers, but that is the author's job, is to set up that background, set up that exposition. And so in a story, it's that same way. Sometimes it's hard for us to get into books or stories because we're like, oh, I'm like 10 pages in and it's really boring. But that's because it has all this exposition to it. So that is the first part, the exposition, and it's that background, the setting, the characters, what's happening, all of those things that you don't really realize till the next part, which is the rising action. And this is when we normally say, oh, it's starting to like get good. And this is where round characters are developed, more things happen, there's some tension, you kind of see who the antagonist is or the bad guy. And then, of course, there's the climax, which is the part that we as viewers love. It's like the greatest tension. It's the turning point. It's the most intense. It can be mental, where we're inside someone's head, or it can be a physical battle scene, oftentimes in like the Marvel movies or Star Wars. And then after the climax is the falling action. And this is the part that is kind of the right before the resolution. It kind of is starting to wrap things up before things are resolved, which is why it's the resolution. So here is where it is actually wrapped up. There's some sort of closure. Even if we don't love the ending, we understand that there is a bit of closure. And this is, of course, the French meaning, which is kind of unknotting or unraveling, where things are kind of taken up together. There's some other words that I used here that you might not be familiar with, right? Conflict. Normally, there are 2 sides to something. It could be person versus person, persons versus themselves, kind of this mental quandary, or maybe it's nature, or it could be versus kind of society, or even like a bigger deity, like a god. And then we have our main character, our protagonist, and then we have, of course, kind of our bad villain character, the antagonist. So these are all parts of story and parts of the story that you will write, and really any story, even if it's a simple children's story. We'll have some examples that I will give you. And even when I read to my young children, I see this example of, something happens, oh no, there's a problem, and then it's resolved. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to kind of look on our story, which is Sandra Cicernos' 11. And, oh, excuse me. And we're going to look and see what she did here. So we have the story here. And here it starts off, it's her birthday, right? She's really excited. She goes to school. We get kind of this Mrs. Price, and whose is this? And everyone's not mine. We kind of see that the protagonist, right, the main character, Rachel, is kind of quiet. She doesn't say anything when the sweater is put on her desk. And then we see she's really upset. It's kind of that rising action. And then suddenly she makes her put the sweater on. And we're like, oh, we just feel this empathy towards Rachel, right? Some authority figure making her do something she doesn't want to do. And then, of course, we come to find out that the sweater isn't even hers. It is someone else's. And then she is just ready to go home, and she's 11, and it goes back to her birthday and this type of idea. So I created a story arc. Oh, excuse me, looking for here. Here we go. I created this story arc here, and 2 things I want to show you about my story arc. One of the things you can see is that my mountain is not exactly like the one that I showed you in the PowerPoint. My mountain has a lot more kind of rising action, and the climax is towards the end and then has resolution at the bottom, because I think that's how most stories are written. Most stories are written to be long in the beginning, then it's a climax, and very quickly it kind of wraps up. So our exposition was the birthday, right? It was her birthday. She was excited. There was this red sweater. Someone says it's hers. Mrs. Price gives it to her. She puts it on. She cries. Find out it's not hers. She takes it off, of course. And then we go back to this birthday. Now, this is a really important part, and I tell students this all the time. Bruce Ballinger, who writes about writing, says it's the snake's eating its tail. So it's this kind of circular idea, and circles are really important in a lot of different ways. You see, I wear a ring, I'm married, and if you ever go to a wedding, they talk about like, oh, the circle, how like the love is never ending. We in nature find circles all over. As you're in math, you might kind of notice these patterns and how a radius and diameter are so important. Well, in writing, circles can be really important too, because in this story and in other stories that we're going to be looking at, you might notice that the author starts the same way that they end. And it's this great idea to kind of capture that, oh, okay, it's all coming together again. And you might notice this too, if you are like a movie buff like my husband, that movies sometimes will start with a scene, then they'll go throughout and they'll end with that same scene, whether it's a picture of a house or a person that we see they have physically changed. But it's a way that storytelling kind of wraps up. And we see this here where Sandra Cisternos starts out with the birthday and ends with the birthday. So that's something we want to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we are kind of drafting. So I hope this was helpful, talking a little bit about story arc, trying to connect it to some other things that you have seen or watched, because we watch stories all the time. I know I'm constantly watching, even if you're just watching TikTok, those are stories and you're seeing them in a very short fashion, but it's the same kind of basic elements. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of viewing things, all the different stories that you're capturing.